The year was 1879, and the Arizona Territory stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a sky that seemed too vast for mortal men to comprehend. Red Canyon Ranch sat like a defiant promise carved into the red earth, where cottonwood trees whispered ancient secrets to the wind, and the creek ran silver when the light caught it just right. Cole Harrison had built this place with his own hands, every fence post driven deep into ground that fought him like a living thing. At 25, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen war and survived it, though the ghosts of Gettysburg still visited him in the darkest hours before dawn. His beard was full and dark, his hands already scarred from 2 years of wrestling, a ranch from nothing but rock and stubborn hope. The storm came without warning, the way storms do in country that keeps its own counsel. Thunder rolled across Red Canyon like artillery fire, though Cole was too young then to know how prophetic that sound would prove to be in years to come. Rain fell in sheets that turned the world gray and wild, and Cole's bay gelding moved steady through mud that sucked at its hooves with every step. 3 days of rain had swollen Red Creek beyond anything the old-timers could remember. Cole had spent the morning checking his small herd, counting heads, making sure none had wandered into the low ground where water was beginning to claim territory that had been dry for 40 years. His wife Margaret had wanted to come with him. She usually did. At 23, she was stronger than most men gave her credit for, with her quarter Apache blood and her grandmother's medicine knowledge flowing in her veins like a second heartbeat. But this morning, Cole had refused her company. "Too dangerous," he had said, kissing her forehead at the door of their small cabin. "I'll be back before dark." She had touched his face with both hands the way she did when she was worried but wouldn't say it. "Some of the children from my reading class live across the creek," she had told him. "The singing bird family. If the water rises much more, they won't make it home." That was how Margaret thought, always about others, first, as if her own safety was a luxury she couldn't afford to consider. Cole had promised to check on them to make sure everyone crossed safe. Now, 3 hours later, he was finding families huddled on high ground, their belongings salvaged in whatever they could carry. Most had made it across the creek before it became impassable. But one family was missing: the singing birds. Cole knew them slightly. Running Elk, the father, had helped him track stolen horses the previous summer. A good man, quiet and dignified, with the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself. He had a wife and 2 small children, including a daughter no more than 8 years old with eyes that seemed to hold too much wisdom for such a young face. Their camp should have been just around the next bend, where a stand of cottonwoods offered shelter near the creek's edge. Should have been past tense, because when Cole rode around that bend, there was nothing but water and debris. The camp was gone, swept away like a child's toy in a bathtub, belongings scattered across the current like leaves in a gutter. And in the middle of all that churning brown water, clinging to a cottonwood branch that bent and cracked with each surge, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her long black hair plastered to her skull, her traditional Apache dress clinging to her small frame like a second skin. She was screaming, but the rain and water swallowed most of the sound. What reached Cole's ears was high and desperate, and terrified, the sound of innocence meeting its first true encounter with death. The branch bent further. It was going to break any second now, and when it did, that little girl would disappear into the flood like she had never existed at all. Cole didn't think. There wasn't time for thinking. He swung down from his horse, his boots hitting mud with a wet slap that seemed to echo in the sudden silence between thunder rolls. His lariat rope was already in his hands, 60 feet of braided rawhide that had pulled cattle from bogs and helped build the fences that marked his land as surely as any deed filed in a courthouse. There was a fence post 20 feet back, driven deep into earth, that was still solid despite the saturation. Cole tied one end of the rope around his waist with a bowline knot his father had taught him when he was younger than the girl drowning in front of him. The other end he secured to the post with a double half hitch. The knots would hold probably. The post might not. The rope might break. The current might take them both. But a man didn't ride past a drowning child. That wasn't something Cole's father had needed to teach him. That was just what men did, what decent people did, what anyone with a soul did when faced with the innocence in mortal peril. He waded in. The water hit him like a fist cold, despite the season strong enough to make him stagger and fight for balance. The current pulled at his legs, trying to sweep his feet out from under him and drag him downstream to join the debris and the dreams that the flood had already claimed. The rope around his waist went taut, and Cole felt the fence post creak behind him like an old man's bones. Hold, he thought desperately. Just hold. He pushed deeper. The water reached his waist, then his chest. The girl was still 20 feet away, and the branch she clung to was making sounds no living wood should make, sharp cracks that cut through even the roar of the flood. Hold on, Cole shouted, though she probably couldn't hear him over the chaos of water and wind. I'm coming! Another step. The bottom dropped away beneath his right foot, and suddenly he was swimming the rope, the only thing keeping him from being swept downstream like everything else the flood had claimed. He pulled himself forward, hand over hand, along the rope, fighting the current, with every inch, every breath burning in his lungs like fire. 15 feet, 10 feet. The girl's eyes found his, wide and dark and filled with more terror than any child should ever know. She couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds, but in that moment she seemed to carry the weight of the entire world in her gaze. The branch cracked. Not broke, not yet, but the sound cut through even the roar of water like a gunshot in a cathedral. Cole lunged forward, his hand outstretched, the rope burning around his waist as it took his full weight plus the current's relentless force. His fingers brushed the girl's arm. He missed, tried again, the cold making his hands clumsy and desperate. The branch broke. For one terrible second that stretched like eternity, the girl was in the water, tumbling, going under her small form, disappearing into the brown chaos. Then Cole's hand closed around her wrist, thin as a bird's bone beneath his grip, and he pulled her to him, wrapping his other arm around her small body as the current tried to tear them both away and add them to the flood's grim tally. She was so light, even waterlogged, she weighed almost nothing. But the current didn't care about weight or age or the dreams that hung in the balance. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen her whole world wash away in the space of minutes. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Cole held her closer, sharing what warmth his body had left, and waited. "Mama," the girl finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Papa." Cole's chest tightened like someone had wrapped wire around his ribs. He looked back at the churning creek, at the debris still tumbling past in the current. No one else had been on that branch. No one else had been screaming. He knew what that meant, and so would she, sooner rather than later. "Listen to me, little wolf." Cole heard himself say the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere in his soul that recognized this moment as a turning point that would echo across decades. "You're safe now, but life is going to try to knock you down again, and when it does, you remember this moment. You remember that you survived when everything seemed impossible." Cole wrapped the girl in front of him on the saddle, his coat still around her shoulders, his arms keeping her steady against the gentle motion of the horse. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared ahead with eyes that had gone somewhere far away, somewhere beyond the rain and the loss and the terrible knowledge that she was utterly alone in the world. Margaret saw them coming from the cabin window. She was outside before Cole could dismount, her hands already reaching for the child with the instinct of a woman who understood suffering and had dedicated her life to healing it. "Dear God," Margaret breathed, taking the girl gently from Cole's arms. "What happened?" "Flood took the singing bird camp," Cole said, climbing down slow, every muscle aching from the fight with the current. "Found her in the water. Haven't found anyone else." Margaret's face went pale. She knew what that meant, had seen enough death in her young life to understand the mathematics of survival. She took the girl inside, and Cole followed, watching as his wife worked with practiced efficiency. She stripped the girl's wet clothes, wrapped her in blankets, sat her by the fire that Margaret had built up to a warm glow. She made tea with herbs from her medicine bag, sweet and warm, and coaxed the child to drink. "What's your name, little one?" Margaret asked in English, her voice soft as prayer. The girl looked at her for a long moment, seemed to find something trustworthy in Margaret's face. When she spoke, her English was broken, but clear enough to break their hearts. "Maria," she said. "Maria Singingbird." "Maria," Margaret repeated like she was tasting the name, learning its shape and weight. "That's beautiful. Do you know what happened to your parents, Maria?" The girl's face crumpled. She nodded but didn't speak, couldn't speak, because speaking would make it real in a way that silence could still hold at bay. Margaret pulled her close, and this time the tears came, great racking sobs that shook the girl's small frame like an earthquake of grief. Margaret held her through all of it, rocking slowly, humming something low and wordless that might have been Apache or might have been older than that, something that spoke to the part of the soul that knew sorrow was just love with nowhere to go. Cole turned away to give them privacy, but also because he needed a moment to process what had just happened. Through the window, he could see the rain beginning to ease, the storm passing like a bad dream that leaves you changed forever. He had saved a life today, pulled a child from certain death, but he had the strangest feeling that she might end up saving him in return, though he couldn't imagine how or when or why. That night, after Maria had cried herself into exhausted sleep in their bed, Margaret joined Cole on the porch. They sat in silence for a while, listening to water drip from the roof like a clock counting down to something neither of them could name. "I'll ride out at first light," Cole said finally. "Look for the parents for the boy, too." She said she had a younger brother. Margaret nodded, her hand finding his in the darkness. "She's so small," Margaret whispered. "So alone." "We'll find her family," Cole said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Someone survived. But even as he said it, Cole knew in his heart that the flood had been thorough in its destruction. The next day, he and Samuel Ironwood would ride out as soon as there was light enough to see by, and they would find the father's body 2 miles downstream, caught in a log jam. They would find the mother and baby another mile past, that washed up on a sandbar like driftwood from a broken dream. Maria stayed with them for a week while they searched for her brother or other family members. It took 7 days to get word to Thomas, the boy who was with his grandmother in a different camp. 7 days during which Maria began to smile again, began to trust again, began to believe that maybe the world wasn't entirely made of loss and water and screaming wind. The day they came to take her, Maria clung to Margaret and wouldn't let go. Her grandmother was old and stern and traditional, weathered by decades of watching her people's world shrink like water in the desert. She said Maria needed to be with her own kind, needed to learn the old ways, and she was right in the way that elders often are, about things that matter more than comfort. They had no claim on that child except the one made in water and fear and the simple human decency that says, you don't let innocence drown if you can prevent it. But before she left, Cole knelt down and looked her in the eyes, and he reminded her of what he had said in the water. Maria looked at him with those big dark eyes that had seen too much, and said in her broken English, "I come back when I strong. I come back and thank you." Cole told her she didn't owe him anything, but she shook her head with the certainty that only children possess about the important things. "I owe everything," she said. "I promise I find you. I come back." And then she was gone, riding away with her grandmother toward a future Cole couldn't imagine leaving behind only the echo of a promise and the memory of a moment when doing the right thing had felt as natural as breathing. 20 years passed like pages in a book, read too quickly, full of small joys and large sorrows, of seasons that came and went like old friends keeping their own counsel. Red Canyon Ranch grew from a dream into a reality, from a hope into a legacy, but not without paying the price that the territory demanded from everyone who tried to make something permanent in a land designed for wandering. Margaret died in the winter of 1884, 5 years after they had given Maria back to her people. The sickness came slowly, at first disguised as fatigue from the endless work of ranch life. Then came the cough, then the weight loss, then the pain that made her double over when she thought Cole wasn't looking. But what Cole didn't know until much later was that Margaret's illness was not the natural disease it appeared to be. 3 months before her symptoms began, William Garrett, a wealthy landowner with interests throughout the territory, had visited Red Canyon Ranch with an offer to purchase the property. Margaret had refused, explaining that the land was sacred to her grandmother's people and could never be sold. Garrett had left that day with polite words and hidden fury, but he had also left behind a small gift, a bottle of patent medicine that he claimed would help with the headaches that Margaret had been experiencing. The medicine was actually a slow-acting poison designed to mimic the symptoms of cancer while gradually destroying the victim's body from within. Margaret suspected the truth in her final days when the pain became unbearable, and she began to understand that her illness followed no natural pattern. With her remaining strength, she wrote a letter to Cole, sealing it with wax and hiding it behind a loose stone in their hearth, with instructions that it should only be opened if their land was ever threatened by the same forces that had killed her. She died on a morning when the cottonwood outside their window was full of birds singing like nothing in the world had changed. Cole buried her beneath that tree, dug the grave himself with hands that blistered and bled and carved her name into a piece of wood that he planned to replace with stone when he could afford it. He never did replace it. Somehow, the simple wooden marker seemed more honest, more true to the woman who had preferred substance over style, who had given her heart to the land and to him without reservation or regret. For 15 years, Cole was alone. He talked more to horses than to people, found more comfort in the silence of the canyon than in the forced conversation of town visits. The ranch kept running because ranches have to run, because cattle don't care about your personal grief, because the land demands attention, whether your heart is whole or shattered into pieces too small to count. He became the hermit of Red Canyon, the subject of speculation and occasional pity among the good people of Copper Springs. Some said he was touched in the head by grief. Others said he was just too proud to admit he needed human companionship. A few understood that some men aren't made for easy healing, that some wounds are too deep to close completely, that sometimes solitude isn't escape, but just another form of faithfulness. But promises have a way of keeping themselves even when the people who make them forget they were ever spoken. Margaret's words echoed in the wind that moved through the cottonwood branches, whispered in the creek that ran silver in the morning light, waited patiently in the rhythm of seasons that measured out the years like a cosmic heartbeat. Autumn of 1899 came to Red Canyon like a memory returning after long absence, painting the cottonwood leaves gold and filling the air with the kind of crisp clarity that made even broken hearts remember what hope felt like. Cole was 45 now, gray threading his beard like silver wire, his hands marked by nearly 2 decades of solitary labor. He'd grown comfortable with loneliness, the way some men grow comfortable with chronic pain, not because it stopped hurting, but because it became so familiar that silence felt normal. The storm came in just before sunset, the way storms did in Arizona when the season started to turn. Cole was checking the cattle, making sure none had wandered into the low ground, where Red Creek ran mostly dry this time of year. Experience had taught him, caution had shown him that water could rise faster than common sense could retreat, that the same creek that barely trickled in September could become a killing flood with an hour's worth of the right rain. He found a young calf stuck in a ravine, bleeding pitifully while its mother paced above like an anxious sentry. Getting it out took the better part of an hour, and by the time Cole had the animal safely reunited with its mother, rain was falling and his joints ached in ways they hadn't 20 years before. 45 wasn't old, but it wasn't young either, not out here where hard work aged a man faster than calendar years, where every fence post driven and every stubborn steer wrestled to the ground left its mark in muscle and bone and the accumulated wisdom of survival. Cole returned to the barn wet and tired, his clothes plastered to his skin, his hat dripping water like a roof with holes in it. He settled the rescued calf in dry hay, covered it with a blanket, and stood there for a moment listening to the rain drum against the barn walls with increasing intensity. The sound reminded him of that other storm, the one that had brought Maria Singingbird into his life and then taken her away again. He wondered sometimes what had happened to her, whether she had survived the hard years on the reservation, whether she had married, whether she remembered him at all. Probably not. Children forgot, moved on, built new lives from the ashes of old ones. It was a blessing, Margaret used to say, the ability to leave pain behind and move forward into whatever came next. Cole walked to the cabin through rain that was easing now, the worst of the storm already passing, like a train disappearing around a mountain curve. He would make coffee, heat up some beans, eat alone at the table like he had done for 15 years. Another night no different from the 1,000 that had come before. Except this night was different. As he reached the porch, Cole saw movement on the southern trail. A rider approaching through the rain, moving with the confidence of someone born to the saddle, someone for whom horse and rider were one entity instead of 2 separate beings trying to find common ground. His hand drifted to the Colt peacemaker at his belt, not from fear, but from habit, from the caution that kept men alive in country that didn't forgive carelessness. The rider came closer, and Cole could see it was a woman on a paint mare moving through the storm like she owned it, like weather was just another element to be mastered rather than endured. Long black hair hung wet down her back. She wore leather and beadwork, traditional Apache clothing that spoke of pride maintained despite decades of pressure to abandon old ways for new ones. She stopped at the gate, dismounted with fluid grace, and stood looking at him across the yard that separated his past from whatever was about to become his future. Then she spoke, and her voice carried across the space between them like a bullet finding its target. Mr. Cole Harrison of Red Canyon Ranch. Her voice was steady calm with an accent that spoke of someone who had learned English well, but not first, who carried her heritage in the rhythm of her words like music played on an instrument carved from different wood. Cole stepped off the porch, his hand still near his gun, barring out his habit more than suspicion. "That's right," he said carefully. "Do I know you, ma'am?" She took a step closer, and even in the fading light, Cole could see her face clearly now. She was young, maybe late 20s, with strong features and dark eyes that looked at him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, like she could see through his skin to count the beats of his heart. "You did once," she said, and there was something in her voice now, something that made the years fold back on themselves like pages in a book read backwards. "20 years ago, you pulled a little Apache girl from a flood. You told her to stay brave and that she would make it through anything." The words hit Cole like a physical blow, like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart with iron fingers. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the woman in front of him and try to find the child he had rescued in that face. And slowly, incredibly, he found her. The same eyes, the same determined, set to her jaw, older and harder, and shaped by years he knew nothing about but unmistakably her. The little girl who had promised to come back, who had said she owed him everything, who had ridden away with her grandmother toward a future he couldn't imagine. "Maria," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking her name too loudly might break whatever spell had brought her back to him. She nodded, and something in her expression shifted, softened, revealed just for a moment the child she had been beneath the woman she had become. "My name is Maria Singingbird," she said formally, like she was introducing herself at a gathering of strangers instead of returning to the place where her second life had begun. Years of isolation had left him unpracticed at normal human interaction, let alone something like this, something that felt like destiny wearing the disguise of coincidence. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why, may I come in?" Maria asked. "It's been a long ride, and what I have to say deserves more than a conversation in your yard." Cole nodded, still too stunned to do much else. He took her horse's reins and led the animal to the barn, giving himself a few minutes to process what was happening, while he unsaddled the mare and rubbed her down with practiced efficiency. Maria followed him, watching as he worked with the automatic competence of a man who had been caring for horses longer than he had been caring for anything else. "You take good care of your animals," Maria observed. "Animals don't complicate things," Cole said, then realized how that sounded to a woman who had just ridden out of his past like a ghost made flesh. "I mean, they're honest. You feed them, treat them right, they return the favor. Simple." Maria nodded, like she understood exactly what he meant, like she had learned the same lesson from different teachers in different circumstances. When the horse was settled with feed and water, Cole led her to the cabin, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to ask. Inside, he lit the lamps and started a fire in the hearth, his hands moving through familiar routines while his brain tried to catch up with this impossible reality. Maria stood near the fireplace, looking around the small space with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, every photograph on the mantel, every book on the shelf, every sign of the life Cole had built and maintained in solitude. Her gaze lingered on the photographs, particularly one of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Your wife," she asked softly. Was Cole said the word carrying 15 years of accumulated weight. "Margaret. She passed 15 years ago. I'm sorry." Cole busied himself making coffee, needing something to do with his hands, while his heart tried to find its normal rhythm again. When he finally sat down across from Maria at his small table, two steaming cups between them, like an offering to whatever gods governed impossible reunions, the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. "You said you've been looking for me," Cole finally said. "White boy," Maria wrapped her hands around her co, not drinking, just holding it like she needed the warmth more than the caffeine. "Do you remember what you told me that day when you pulled me from the water?" Cole tried to think back. The memory was there, vivid in some ways and blurred in others, like a photograph that had been handled too often. He remembered the cold, the fear, the weight of the child in his arms. But his exact words. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "You said I was safe, that I should stay brave, that if I stayed brave, I would make it through anything life threw at me." The words sounded familiar in her voice, like an echo of something he had once known but forgotten in the daily business of living. I held on to those words. Maria continued, her dark eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made him want to look away and yet made it impossible to do so. When my grandmother took my brother and me back to the reservation when my mother's death became real, instead of just a nightmare when the government moved us from camp to camp like we were cattle, I remembered what you said. She paused, taking a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 20 years. My grandmother died when I was 15. She was old and the winters where I were hard, and one morning she just didn't wake up. My brother Thomas was only 11. I had to raise him, had to keep us both alive. And every time I thought I couldn't do it, every time I wanted to give up, I heard your voice in my head telling me to stay brave. Cole felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation like someone wrapping wire around his ribs and pulling it taut. He had had no idea, no conception, that a few words spoken in a moment of crisis could carry such weight, could sustain a life through decades of hardship he couldn't even imagine. What happened to Thomas? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. A shadow crossed Maria's face like a cloud blocking the sun. He joined the cavalry as a scout when he was 14. Lied about his age, said he wanted to prove himself in the white man's world. I haven't seen him in 8 years. I'm sorry. Don't be. He made his choice. I made mine. Which was? Maria looked at him steadily, and in her gaze Cole saw something that reminded him of Margaret, the same quiet strength that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you stood for, regardless of what the world thought about it. To learn, to survive, to become someone who could help others the way I was helped. I apprenticed with a medicine woman, learned the healing arts, plants, potions, how to set bones, how to bring down fevers. I traveled from camp to camp, settlement to settlement, helping where I could. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that made Cole understand this was the real reason she had come. But I also had another purpose. My grandmother told me stories before she died, stories about my mother's family, about sacred places and hidden treasures that the Apache people had protected for generations. She told me about a silver mine that belonged to our people, marked on an ancient map that was lost in the flood that killed my parents. Cole leaned forward, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. The night before she died, my grandmother had a vision. She saw that map again, saw where the flood had carried it, saw that it had been preserved by the same waters that had taken everything else. She told me that the map was waiting hidden where the cottonwood trees grow by the red rocks, waiting for someone brave enough to reclaim what belonged to our people. Red Canyon, Cole said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Red Canyon, Maria confirmed. The map is somewhere on your land, Cole Harrison. Hidden for 20 years waiting for me to come back and find it. But I didn't come here just to search for lost treasure. She stood up, walking to the window that looked out toward the cottonwood tree where Margaret lay buried. I came because I learned something else in my travels. I learned that there are men who would kill for land like this, who would use any excuse to take it away from a people they consider unworthy to own it. And I learned that you are in danger. Before Cole could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Multiple riders were coming up the trail, moving with purpose in the darkness. Cole grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window, Maria beside him, both of them watching as three men rode into the yard. The lead rider was a large man in his early 50s, well-dressed, despite the rain, riding an expensive horse, with the confidence of someone who believed money could purchase anything, including other people's dreams. Cole recognized him immediately, William Garrett, the man who had visited Margaret years ago, the man whose medicine had killed the woman Cole loved. Behind Garrett rode Vernon Blake, a thin man with calculating eyes, and the kind of smile that made honest people want to count their fingers after shaking hands. The third man was clearly hired muscle, the way he wore his gun, and sat his horse announcing his profession to anyone who cared to notice. "Cole Harrison," Garrett called out as he reined in his horse at the gate. "Beautiful evening for visitors, don't you think?" Cole stepped onto the porch, his rifle ready, but not openly threatening. "What do you want, Garrett?" "Just being neighborly," Garrett said, though his smile never reached his eyes. "Thought I should meet your house guest." His gaze shifted to Maria, who had followed Cole outside, and something ugly flickered across Garrett's face, the kind of look that reduced a human being to something less than fully real. "This is Miss Maria Singing Bird," Cole said, his voice carrying a warning that most sensible men would have heeded. "She's a friend." Apache, Garrett observed as if he was identifying a particular breed of livestock. Should have known you'd take up with another savage. First that half-breed wife of yours, now this. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Cole felt his hands clench around his rifle, felt the familiar surge of anger that had gotten him into trouble before and would probably get him into trouble again. You'll speak respectfully about Miss Singing Bird and my wife, or you'll leave my property. Cole said, his voice level but hard as winter ground. Garrett laughed a sound with no humor in it. Your property. That's interesting, Harrison, because my lawyer here has been doing some research into your land claims, and it seems there might be some irregularities. Blake stepped forward, pulling a rolled document from his saddlebag with theatrical precision. Mr. Harrison, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news about the title to Red Canyon Ranch. When your wife died in 1884, the property should have been formally transferred to your sole ownership. According to county records, that never happened. Legally speaking, the current ownership is questionable. Cole felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not literally, but in the way that the world sometimes reveals itself to be less solid than you thought it was. But Maria stepped forward, positioning herself slightly to one side, where she would have a clear line of sight to all three men if trouble started. How convenient, she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that came before storms. Mr. Garrett discovers these alleged irregularities just when he needs a legal excuse to steal land that doesn't belong to him. Tell me, Mr. Blake, did your research also uncover the reason why Mr. Harrison's wife died so conveniently before these ownership questions could arise? Blake's confident expression flickered slightly. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I mean the poison, Maria said simply, and the words hit the evening air like lightning. The patent medicine that Mr. Garrett so kindly provided for Margaret Harrison's headaches. The medicine that slowly destroyed her body while making her death look like natural illness. Garrett's face went white, then red, then settled into a mask of fury that made his earlier politeness look like what it had always been, a thin veneer over murderous intent. You can't prove that, he snarled. Perhaps not yet, Maria replied. But I'm very good at finding hidden things, Mr. Garrett. Maps, documents, evidence of crimes that men think they've buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. And I have a feeling that if I look hard enough, I'll find proof of exactly how Margaret Harrison really died. The hired gunman shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his weapon. The evening air seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether words would give way to violence. 30 days, Harrison, Garrett said, finally jerking his horse's reins with more force than necessary. Produce clear title or prepare to vacate. And keep your Apache woman away from town if you know what's good for both of you. Some people might not be as understanding as I am. The three men rode away, leaving behind a wake of tension and the kind of silence that follows close calls with disaster. Cole watched them disappear down the trail, then turned to Maria. You shouldn't have provoked him like that, he said. Now he knows you're a threat. He knew that the moment I arrived, Maria replied. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Maria looked at him with surprise, as if he had asked why the sky was blue or why water ran downhill. Of course we. Did you think I came back after 20 years just to watch you lose everything to men like Garrett? Did you think the flood spared me so I could abandon you when you need help most? Cole felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since Margaret died. The feeling of not being alone, of having someone who chose to stand with him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Maria, this could get ugly. Garrett's the kind of man who doesn't lose gracefully, and he's got money enough to hire all the help he needs. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for him, Maria said simply. She walked toward the house, then paused at the door and then looked back at him. Cole, tomorrow I need to search your property. If my grandmother's vision was true, if the map survived the flood and is hidden somewhere on this land, it might give us the proof we need to fight Garrett legally instead of with guns. What kind of proof? Maria's eyes took on a distant look, as if she was seeing something that existed only in memory and prophecy. The map doesn't just show the location of the silver mine. It shows the original boundaries of Apache land, the traditional territory that was never formally ceded to the government. If we can prove that Red Canyon Ranch sits on land that still legally belongs to the Apache people, and that your wife inherited her claim through legitimate Apache law, then Garrett's challenge becomes meaningless. Cole stared at her, feeling hope and skepticism wage war in his chest. A 20-year-old map hidden by a flood. That's a long shot, Maria. Long shots are all I've ever had, she replied, and they've gotten me this far. 3 days later, Maria's patient search of the property was rewarded. Hidden beneath the cottonwood tree where Margaret was buried, wedged between the roots that had grown around it like protective arms, she found what she had been looking for. A bundle wrapped in oiled leather, perfectly preserved despite 2 decades of weather and time. Inside the bundle was the deerskin map her grandmother had seen in her vision, marked with symbols that only someone raised in the old traditions could fully understand. But more importantly, there was also a second document, a deed written in both English and Apache, signed by Dawn Walker, Margaret's grandmother, formally granting Red Canyon and the surrounding territory to Margaret as a wedding gift blessed by Apache law and witnessed by the spirits of the land itself. The symbols on both documents were identical to those that appeared on silver ingots that had been minted from the sacred mine ingots that established Apache ownership of both the land and the mineral rights beneath it. The main doors were blocked by flame, but there was a side entrance smaller that might still be passable. He kicked in the door, smoke billowing out so thick he couldn't see 3 feet in front of him. Dropping low where the air was clearer, he crawled inside, calling to the horses. One of them, a gray mare named Silver, answered with a terrified whinny. Cole followed the sound, found her stall, got the gate open. The horse nearly trampled him, getting out, her eyes rolling white with fear. The second horse, an old bay gelding that had belonged to his father, was already down. Dead from smoke or heart failure or pure terror, Cole couldn't tell. He backed out of the barn as a section of roof collapsed behind him, sending up a shower of sparks that burned holes in his shirt. As he stumbled away from the burning barn, coughing hard enough to taste blood, Cole saw Samuel Ironwood riding hard up the trail, followed by 4 other men from neighboring ranches. They had seen the glow from miles away, had come to help fight the fire. But even with 6 men working, they couldn't save the barn. They managed to keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings, managed to save the rest of the horses, but the south barn burned to the ground. By dawn, there was nothing left but smoking timbers and the acrid smell of destruction. Kerosene, Samuel said grimly, pointing to 3 empty cans he had found hidden in the brush past the fence line. Wasn't even trying to hide it. This was meant to be a message. Message received, Cole said, his voice raw from smoke and rage. The question is, what do we do about it? The answer came sooner than expected. Before noon, Thomas Running Wolf arrived at Red Canyon Ranch, riding a cavalry horse and wearing the blue uniform of a United States Army scout. He was older than Cole had expected, maybe 30, with the lean build and alert eyes of a man who had learned to survive in 2 different worlds without fully belonging to either one. Mr. Harrison, Thomas said formally as he dismounted, I'm Sergeant Thomas Running Wolf, Maria's brother. We need to talk. Cole stepped forward, keeping his rifle ready, but not openly threatening. Maria said you were a cavalry scout. Didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I, Thomas replied, his uniform crisp despite the hard ride. But when word reached Fort Apache that my sister was traveling alone in dangerous territory, that there might be men trying to stop her from reaching her destination, I couldn't ignore it. What kind of men? Thomas's expression darkened. The kind that kill Apache women and call it self-defense. The kind that burn barns and murder horses to send messages. The kind that work for William Garrett. As Thomas spoke, Maria emerged from the cabin where she had been helping tend to Cole's burns from the fire. When she saw her brother, her face went through a dozen different expressions: surprise, joy, pain, hope, and finally a kind of careful neutrality that spoke of 8 years of separation and unhealed wounds. Thomas, she said simply. Maria. He stepped toward her, then stopped, uncertain of his welcome. I heard you were in trouble. I'm always in trouble, she replied. It's never stopped you from staying away before. The words hung between them like a sword cutting both ways. Thomas absorbed the blow without flinching, like a man who knew he deserved it. I blamed you, he said quietly, for Mother, for the flood, for not saving her. I know now that I was wrong, that I was just a child looking for someone to blame for something no one could have prevented. But I've spent 8 years being wrong, 8 years being angry, and I don't know how to stop. Maria looked at her brother, really looked at him, and something in her expression began to soften. You stop by choosing to stop. You stop by deciding that being angry hurts you more than it hurts anyone else. You stop by coming home. Is there still a home to come back to? Instead of answering with words, Maria stepped forward and embraced her brother for the first time in 8 years. Thomas held her carefully like he was afraid she might disappear if he gripped too tightly, and Cole saw tears on both their faces. Now, Maria said when they finally separated, let me show you what I found. She led them to where the documents were hidden, spread out the deerskin map, and the Apache deed explained what they meant and why they represented more than just property claims. Thomas studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read both languages and understand both legal systems. This changes everything, he said finally. If these documents are authentic, if they can be authenticated by Apache elders who remember the original ceremonies, then Garrett's legal challenge becomes meaningless. Apache sovereignty over this land predates territorial authority. Can you help us get them authenticated? Cole asked. Thomas smiled for the first time since his arrival. I can do better than that. I can get you military escort to White Mountain Reservation where Sarah Walking Bear lives. She's 90 years old, nearly blind, but her memory is perfect. She was there when these documents were created. She can testify to their authenticity. White Mountain is 200 miles through rough country, Cole said. If Garrett realizes what we're after, then he'll try to stop us, Maria finished. Which is why we leave tonight, travel fast, and trust that the spirits who preserved these documents for 20 years will continue to protect them until they can speak their truth in a white man's court. That evening, as they prepared for the journey to White Mountain, Thomas took Cole aside for a private conversation. I want you to understand something about my sister, he said. She's not just brave, she's the bravest person I've ever known. When our grandmother died and left us alone, when I was too young and too angry to be of any use, Maria kept us both alive through sheer force of will. I'm beginning to understand that, Cole replied. She's also never loved anyone the way she loves you, Thomas continued. I can see it in the way she looks at you, the way she says your name. She's carried your memory for 20 years, like other people carry lucky charms or sacred objects. You saved her life when she was 8 years old, but more than that, you gave her something to believe in when everything else was gone. Cole felt his throat tighten. I don't know if I'm worthy of that kind of faith. You are, Thomas said simply. At 90 years old, her body had become a collection of aches and limitations, but her mind remained sharp as winter wind, holding memories that stretched back to when this land knew only Apache law and Apache promises. When Maria showed her the documents, explained their significance, told the story of the flood, and the 20-year search that had led to this moment, Sarah nodded as if she had been expecting this visit all her life. I remember the day these papers were signed, she said through Thomas's translation. My sister Dawn Walker was the medicine woman who blessed your marriage, who gave the land as a gift, who saw in visions that white and Apache blood would flow together on red earth until the children of both peoples called each other family. She touched the deerskin map with trembling fingers, tracing symbols that had been sacred before the first white man set foot in Arizona territory. The silver mine marked here has belonged to our people since before memory began. The land around it was never sold, never surrendered, never legally transferred to the territorial government. Your wife inherited a claim that goes back to the beginning of time itself. Will you testify to this in court? Maria asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. I am old, nearly blind. The journey is hard and I am not strong. But for my sister's vision, for the prophecy that has waited 60 years to be fulfilled, I will speak the truth to the white man's law. There are others, Sarah continued, 15 elders who remember Dawn Walker, who witnessed the blessing ceremony, who know the old ways and the old promises. If I go, they will go. But we will need protection. The white man's courts do not always honor Apache testimony, and the men who would steal this land will not hesitate to silence old voices that speak inconvenient truths. We'll find a way, Maria promised, though she didn't yet know how. The return journey took 8 days instead of 5, slowed by the wagon that carried Sarah and the 15 Apache elders who had agreed to testify, protected by a cavalry escort that Thomas had arranged through official channels. Word of their mission had reached the federal government, where officials had decided that preventing the massacre of Apache witnesses would be good for the territory's reputation and the Army's public image. When they finally reached Red Canyon Ranch, Cole felt a surge of relief at seeing his land still intact, his remaining buildings still standing, his cattle still grazing peacefully, in pastures that had been threatened but not conquered. But he also felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. These elderly Apache people had traveled hundreds of miles to help him keep land that had been blessed by their ceremonies and sanctified by their blood. He would not let their sacrifice be wasted. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe was packed beyond capacity on the day of the hearing. Word of the case had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators who came to witness what the newspapers had called a test of whether ancient Apache claims can override established American law. The gallery was filled with settlers, ranchers, merchants, and officials, most of whom had never seen Apache people testify in a court of law. Judge Harrison Whitmore entered at precisely 9 o'clock, his black robes lending additional gravity to a presence that already commanded respect. At 62, he had served on the territorial bench for 8 years, earning a reputation for fairness tempered by strict adherence to legal precedent. He was not a man who could be intimidated by wealth or swayed by popular opinion, but he was also not given to sentimentality when the law required harsh decisions. "This court will come to order," Judge Whitmore announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "We are here to determine the validity of William Garrett's challenge to Cole Harrison's ownership of Red Canyon Ranch. Mr. Blake, you filed the challenge. Present your case." Vernon Blake rose from the plaintiff's table, impeccably dressed and radiating the confidence of a man who believed victory was guaranteed by superior legal preparation. His opening statement was a masterpiece of technical argumentation, painting Cole's ownership as fundamentally flawed by procedural irregularities and jurisdictional questions. "Your Honor," Blake began, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "this is fundamentally a matter of territorial law and federal authority. When Margaret Harrison died in 1884, the jointly held property should have been formally transferred to sole ownership through proper legal channels. No such transfer was ever recorded." He produced county records showing Cole's original filing in 1877, in the absence of any subsequent documentation after Margaret's death. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the original claim itself rests on a fundamentally flawed foundation. The property allegedly came to Margaret Harrison through her Apache grandmother, but Apache land ownership was not recognized under territorial law in 1877. Therefore, the entire chain of title is invalid from its inception." Blake sat down with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just delivered a knockout blow. His argument was legally sound, technically correct, and almost impossible to counter without evidence that most people assumed had been lost or destroyed decades ago. Judge Whitmore looked across the courtroom to where Cole sat with Maria at his side. "Mr. Harrison, you're representing yourself in this matter. How do you respond to these allegations?" Cole stood slowly, his hands steady, despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance. He was not a lawyer or a politician or a man comfortable with public speaking, but he was someone who had learned that truth, when spoken simply and directly, had its own kind of power. "Your Honor, I'm not a man who's good with fancy legal arguments or technical procedures. I'm a rancher who built Red Canyon with my wife 22 years ago. We built it on land her grandmother gave us as a wedding gift, blessed by both Apache tradition and territorial law. I buried my wife there 15 years back, and that land has my sweat and my blood and my tears soaked into every acre." He paused, looking around the courtroom at the faces of people who would judge not just his claim, but the kind of justice that would prevail in the new century. When Sarah placed her weathered hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a 90-year-old Apache woman testifying in territorial court about events that predated American jurisdiction in this territory. "I am Sarah Walking Bear." Her testimony began through Thomas's careful translation. "My sister was Dawn Walker, medicine woman and keeper of the sacred places. When Margaret White Deer came to us in 1877 wanting to marry the white man Cole Harrison, my sister was at first opposed. But then she met this man, saw his respect for our ways, saw his love for our land and our people." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, and even those who couldn't understand Apache could hear the authority in her tone, the weight of absolute truth spoken without embellishment or doubt. "My sister gave them the land as a wedding gift, following both the white man's law and our traditional ways. She blessed their union and their claim to the Red Canyon where the waters run clear and the cottonwood trees grow tall. But more than that, she saw in visions that this joining of white and Apache blood would create a bridge between our peoples, that children would be born from this union who would belong to both worlds and help heal the wounds that divide us. Thomas paused in his translation to pull out the deerskin-wrapped documents that Sarah had carried from White Mountain. As he unwrapped them, revealing the carefully preserved deed and map, a murmur ran through the courtroom like wind through wheat. "Your Honor," Thomas said, "I present the original deed to Red Canyon Ranch signed by Dawn Walker, Margaret Harrison Cole Harrison, and witnessed by Samuel Ironwood and Reverend Thomas Grain. I also present the traditional map that shows the boundaries of Apache territory and the location of the sacred silver mine that has belonged to our people since before the white man came to this land." Judge Whitmore examined both documents, carefully holding them up to the light, studying the signatures and the Apache symbols that decorated their margins. His expression revealed nothing but Blake's face had gone pale as he realized that his careful legal strategy had just encountered obstacles he had never anticipated. "Mr. Blake," the judge said quietly, "why weren't these documents in the county records?" Blake recovered his composure with professional smoothness. "Your Honor, even if these documents are authentic, they don't resolve the fundamental issue. Apache land ownership wasn't recognized under territorial law in 1877. These papers, while perhaps historically interesting, have no legal weight in this court." But Judge Whitmore was studying the documents more carefully, now paying particular attention to the dates and the official seals that appeared on both papers. When he looked up, his expression had changed subtly, and something in his eyes suggested that Blake had made a critical error in his assumptions. "That's where you're wrong, counselor," Judge Whitmore said, his voice carrying an authority that made the entire courtroom lean forward. "I've been conducting my own research into this case, Mr. Blake, and I've discovered some very interesting facts about your client's attempts to influence these proceedings." He set the documents down and fixed Blake with a stare that could have melted steel. "Mr. Garrett approached me through intermediaries 6 weeks ago, offering substantial sums to rule in his favor regardless of the evidence presented. When I refused his bribe, he apparently decided to proceed with this legal challenge anyway, believing that technical arguments would overcome the truth." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs and angry exclamations. Blake's confident expression cracked completely, and Garrett half rose from his seat before thinking better of drawing additional attention to himself. "Furthermore," Judge Whitmore continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "I've also discovered why Mr. Garrett is so interested in acquiring Red Canyon Ranch. Geological surveys conducted by the Territorial Office have revealed significant silver deposits beneath the property. Mr. Garrett's sudden concern for legal technicalities becomes much more understandable when viewed in light of these mineral rights." He held up the deerskin map, pointing to symbols that mark the location of the mine. "This traditional Apache document not only establishes the boundaries of tribal territory, it also marks the location of silver deposits that were known to the indigenous people long before any territorial surveys were conducted. The mine shown on this map corresponds exactly to the deposits that have recently been discovered by government geologists." Blake tried to object, to argue that ancient maps couldn't override modern legal procedures, but Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. In 1877, when this deed was executed, the White Mountain Apache had a formal treaty with the territorial government. That treaty, while later modified and superseded, was legal and binding at the time it was signed. It explicitly recognized Apache sovereignty over certain lands, including the area now known as Red Canyon. The judge turned his attention back to the deed, reading from it carefully. Dawn Walker's ownership under the 1877 treaty was legitimate and legally recognized. "You're destroying everything this territory stands for." The words hung in the air like poison, and Judge Whitmore's expression turned to ice. "Mr. Garrett, you will sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt of court. And if you ever again use such language in my courtroom, you will spend the next 30 days in jail contemplating the difference between civilized discourse and racist bigotry." But Garrett was beyond rational thought, consumed by the fury of a man who had spent a fortune orchestrating what he believed would be a simple legal theft, only to see his carefully laid plans crumble in the face of documents he had never known existed and testimony he couldn't bribe or intimidate into silence. In his rage, he made the mistake that would cost him everything. Pulling a small derringer from his coat pocket, he aimed it directly at Cole, his hands shaking with fury as he prepared to solve his legal problems with violence. "If I can't have that land legally," he snarled, Then nobody will have it at all. The courtroom erupted in screams and chaos as people dove for cover, but Maria was already moving, her reflexes honed by 20 years of surviving in dangerous country. She threw herself between Cole and Garrett just as the Derringer fired the bullet, catching her in the shoulder and spinning her around. Maria, Cole caught her as she fell, her blood staining his shirt, his heart stopping at the sight of her pale face and closed eyes. But Thomas was already in motion, his cavalry training taking over as he tackled Garrett to the ground, wrestling the gun away from him, while courthouse guards rushed to assist. The would-be assassin found himself face down on the floor with a cavalry sergeant's knee in his back and iron shackles being fastened around his wrists. "Stay with me," Cole whispered to Maria, his hands trying to stop the bleeding from her shoulder, while his voice broke with fear and desperate love. "Stay brave, little wolf. Stay brave for me." She opened her eyes, smiled up at him, despite the pain, and whispered the words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Always brave for you, Cole Harrison. Always brave for the man who saved my life and gave me a reason to live it." The aftermath was swift and decisive. William Garrett was charged with attempted murder, bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a dozen other crimes that would keep him in territorial prison until he was too old to threaten anyone ever again. Vernon Blake was disbarred and prosecuted as an accessory to Garrett's crimes, his legal career ending in the same courtroom where he had thought to steal a good man's land through technical trickery and moral bankruptcy. Judge Whitmore's ruling was unambiguous. Cole Harrison's ownership of Red Canyon Ranch was confirmed and established beyond any possibility of future challenge. The Apache deed was filed with the territorial records, the silver mine was formally recognized as part of the property, and the mineral rights were confirmed as belonging to Cole and his heirs in perpetuity. But more than that, the case established a legal precedent that would protect other Apache land claims throughout the territory, ensuring that indigenous property rights based on legitimate treaties and traditional sovereignty would be respected by American courts. Cole and Maria were married 3 weeks later, as soon as her shoulder had healed enough to allow her to stand without assistance. The ceremony took place beneath the cottonwood tree where Margaret was buried, with Reverend Thomas Grain performing the service, and Samuel Ironwood standing as best man. Thomas gave his sister away with the pride of a brother who had finally found his way back to family after years of exile and anger. Sarah Walking Bear and the other Apache elders blessed the union according to traditional ceremonies, their words carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled and promises kept across generations. The cavalry escort provided an honor guard, their presence, a reminder that justice had been served and that the federal government stood ready to protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or heritage. The wedding feast that followed was attended by half the territory, it seemed. People came from as far away as Santa Fe to witness the marriage that had become a symbol of hope, a proof that love could overcome hatred, that bridges could be built across chasms that seemed too wide to span. But for Cole and Maria, the most important moment came at sunset when they stood alone on the porch of their cabin, watching the land stretch endlessly before them toward mountains that had witnessed everything and remembered it all. "So what happens now?" Maria asked, settling into the chair beside his, her bandaged shoulder, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. "Now we build," Cole said simply. "We plant crops and raise cattle, and maybe some children if we're blessed that way. We prove that Sarah's prophecy was right, that two peoples can become one people when they choose love over fear." Maria smiled, thinking of the school she wanted to build for children of both backgrounds, of the medical practice she could establish to serve everyone who needed healing, of the life they could create together that would honor both their heritages and point the way toward a future that neither could achieve alone. "The land remembers," she said, repeating Sarah Walking Bear's words from that day at White Mountain. "It does," Cole agreed. "Every promise kept, every life saved, every bridge built between people who thought they had nothing in common. This earth holds all of it, keeps all of it safe until the next generation needs to remember why love matters more than fear." As the stars came out above Red Canyon Ranch, Cole and Maria sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other across impossible distances and improbable circumstances, who had proven that some promises keep themselves regardless of how much time passes or how many obstacles stand in the way. The silver mine that had caused so much trouble provided the foundation for a prosperity that lasted generations. But Cole and Maria used their wealth not for personal luxury, but for building the kind of community that Dawn Walker had envisioned in her prophecies, a place where Apache and white children learned together, where traditional medicine and modern healing worked side by side, where the color of your skin mattered less than the content of your character. The school Maria established became famous throughout the territory for the quality of its education and the diversity of its student body. Children who had been taught to fear and hate each other learned instead that their differences made them stronger, that their mixed heritage was a gift rather than a burden, that the future belonged to those who could build bridges instead of walls. Cole lived to be 78 years old, long enough to see his children grow up and have children of their own, long enough to watch the little school become a great institution, long enough to know that the promise he had made to a drowning child had grown into something larger than he had ever imagined possible. Maria lived to be 91, long enough to become a legend herself, the Apache woman who had challenged injustice and won, who had proven that courage came in all colors, and that love was the strongest force in the human heart. Her medical practice served 3 generations of families, and her wisdom was sought by governors and generals who came to Red Canyon seeking the counsel of the woman who had bridged 2 worlds. When she finally died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, when the cottonwood trees were full of singing birds, she was buried beside Cole beneath the ancient tree that had sheltered their love and witnessed their triumphs. Their graves were marked not with expensive monuments, but with simple wooden markers like the one Cole had carved for Margaret so many years before, proving that some people understand that the value of a life is measured not in gold or silver, but in the love that survives long after the body has returned to dust. The land remembered as it always had and always would. It held their story in soil that knew no difference between Apache blood and white blood, between tears of sorrow and tears of joy, between the dreams that shaped the world and the world that shaped the dreamers brave enough to believe that love in the end was the only law that truly mattered. Red Canyon Ranch thrived for generations, becoming home to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried the story forward like a sacred trust. The cottonwood tree grew taller over the years, its roots reaching deeper into earth that held the promises of the past and the hopes of the future, its branches spreading wider to shade new graves and new lives, new loves and new dreams. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the leaves just right, people would swear they could hear voices whispering in the branches. The voice of a young cowboy telling a drowning child to stay brave. The voice of an Apache woman promising to return and repay a debt of the heart. The voice of an old medicine woman prophesying a future where love conquered fear and difference became strength. The flood that had brought them together was remembered not as a tragedy, but as the beginning of something beautiful. Proof that even the darkest storms could carry unexpected gifts, that even the most devastating losses could plant seeds for unimaginable hope. The promise that had echoed across 20 years of separation became the foundation for a love that lasted twice as long, a testament to the truth that some bonds are stronger than time, stronger than fear, stronger than all the forces that seek to divide human hearts from their deepest calling. In the end, the story of Cole Harrison and Maria Singingbird became part of the larger story of the American West, proof that the frontier's greatest treasures were not found in gold mines or silver veins, but in the connections that transform strangers into family enemies, into allies, and fear, into the kind of love that could weather any storm and build any future that brave people dared to imagine. The land held their memory like it held all memories, in soil and stone, and the roots of trees that would shade children not yet born, keeping their promises safe until the day when new dreamers would need to remember that courage and love and the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds were the true inheritance of those who called this red earth home.